I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I've always felt like the odd one out in my family. My younger brother Ethan, who's 28, has been the golden child for as long as I can remember. I used to think it was just in my head, but over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It's not just the little things, it's been a constant from our childhood to now. Looking back, I don't know if I should have done something earlier or if it would have even mattered. Growing up, Ethan and I had a pretty typical sibling dynamic, at least, that's how it probably looked from the outside. But even as kids, it was clear who my parents doted on. For my 8th birthday, I got a modest cake and a set of secondhand toys. 2 months later, Ethan got a backyard carnival for his 6th birthday, complete with a clown, face painting, and pony rides. I remember sitting there, staring at my slice of cake, and realizing it wasn't just about the party, it was about what it symbolized. In school, the difference was even more obvious. When Ethan struggled with a subject, my parents hired the best tutors money could buy. When I aced my classes, they'd say something like, "You're so smart, you don't need help." I think they genuinely believed it was a compliment. The final blow came when I won a regional academic competition in high school. It was a big deal, one of those events where they handed out trophies and invited the local press. My parents promised to attend, but at the last minute, they skipped it. Ethan had a soccer game that same day. Then came college. I worked my butt off to get into a decent school and relied on loans to pay for it. My parents didn't contribute a cent, but they cheered me on as I signed the papers that would leave me in debt for years. Ethan's experience was the exact opposite. My parents covered his full tuition and bought him a car as a graduation gift. It wasn't even subtle. I remember asking my mom why they couldn't spare anything for me, and she brushed it off, saying, "It's just different with Ethan." Fast forward to adulthood. I worked hard, saved every penny, and bought my first home in my late 20s. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. Ethan, on the other hand, drifted from one job to another, usually quitting within a year. He'd call my parents for help every time he ran into financial trouble, and they always bailed him out. When I asked for advice during my home buying process, they barely paid attention. Meanwhile, they co-signed a loan for Ethan to buy a house that was way out of his budget. It didn't take a crystal ball to see where that was headed. My wedding was another eye-opener. I'm not one to expect handouts, but it stung when my parents told me they couldn't contribute because things were tight. A month later, they gifted Ethan $20,000 for his future wedding, even though he wasn't even engaged. At that point, I started pulling away. I still loved my family, but I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't being treated as less important. The family business was another sore spot. My parents run a small but successful business that I helped grow over the years. I'd spent countless weekends helping out, even as a kid. When I got older, I pitched ideas to expand the business, many of which paid off. But when I asked about a formal stake in the company, they laughed it off. Meanwhile, Ethan, who had no involvement, was promised the entire business in their will. The breaking point came about a year ago. Ethan defaulted on his house loan after losing yet another job, and my parents called me. They didn't just ask for advice. They expected me to help bail him out. When I refused, my dad said something that still echoes in my head: family comes first. I hung up the phone and cried. Not because of what they said, but because I finally realized where I stood. Since then, I've started therapy and focused on building a life where I don't rely on their approval. I landed a big promotion, started traveling, and even got back into hobbies I'd forgotten about. But my family's drama isn't over, not even close. Ethan's poor decisions have only made things worse for my parents, and it's clear the tension is reaching a boiling point. A few weeks ago, I decided to share my story online, partly to vent and partly to hear from others. I thought it might help to see if anyone else had gone through something similar. What I didn't expect was how much worse everything would get after that. Update 1. Not long after I shared my story, things started spiraling faster than I could have imagined. Ethan came up with his latest grand idea, a business plan for a luxury lifestyle service. He claimed it would be a subscription-based app offering access to high-end events, private jets, and exclusive deals. It sounded like something pulled from a late-night infomercial, but he pitched it to my parents like it was a guaranteed goldmine. I wasn't surprised when my parents backed him. What did shock me was how far they were willing to go. They drained a significant portion of their retirement fund to invest in Ethan's app idea. It wasn't just the money, they also co-signed another loan for him, using their house as collateral. When I found out, I couldn't stay silent. I pointed out Ethan's long history of failed ventures and irresponsible spending, but my parents brushed me off. They said I was being unsupportive, that I should be happy Ethan was trying to build something for his future. Predictably, Ethan's business fell apart within 6 months. He didn't do any market research, had no concrete business plan, and wasted most of the funds on flashy marketing stunts that didn't pan out. He even leased an expensive office space that he couldn't afford after the first quarter. When it all collapsed, he claimed the economy was to blame, and my parents swallowed his excuses whole. Meanwhile, my parents started showing signs of financial strain. They stopped eating out and canceled a vacation they'd been planning for months, but they still wouldn't hold Ethan accountable. Instead, they started talking about how unlucky he was and how hard it is to run a business these days. Things came to a head at a family gathering. Ethan showed up and acted like nothing had happened. He was laughing, eating, and even bragging about how his next idea would be the one to really take off. Someone casually asked why the first one hadn't worked out, and Ethan turned to me, saying, "Well, maybe if certain people had been more supportive, things would have gone differently." That comment hit a nerve. I stood up and laid everything out in front of everyone, how I'd worked hard for everything I had, never asked for a dime, and still got no recognition from my parents. Meanwhile, Ethan had been handed chance after chance and still managed to blow it every time. The room went dead silent. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door on his way. After that, my parents started reaching out to me more frequently, but it wasn't for emotional support. They wanted money to help cover Ethan's debts. My dad called me one evening and casually mentioned how they were falling behind on the loan payments for their house. He hinted that I should step in since family always helps family. I stayed calm and explained that I couldn't, especially considering my own financial goals. When I reminded him of how they had refused to help me during my hardest times, he quickly ended the conversation. The extended family started to notice the cracks. My aunts and uncles, who had always been polite but distant at gatherings, began to speak up. One of my aunts called out my parents directly, saying it was obvious they had always favored Ethan, and now they were paying the price. I didn't even know some of my relatives had noticed until they started pulling me aside to share their thoughts. It was oddly validating, but it didn't change the fact that my parents were still firmly in Ethan's corner. Ethan, of course, couldn't let things go quietly. He took to social media, posting vague updates about how he was being sabotaged by people who were supposed to support him. He didn't name me outright, but it was obvious to anyone who knew us. Some of his friends chimed in with supportive comments, but others asked pointed questions about what really happened. The posts eventually fizzled out when he realized they weren't gaining the sympathy he'd hoped for. In the meantime, therapy became my lifeline. I was learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, which was easier said than done. Still, I kept my focus on my own life and tried not to get pulled into the chaos. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from an old family friend. She'd seen one of Ethan's social media posts and reached out to tell me she admired my independence and had always felt I'd been treated unfairly. It wasn't a big gesture, but it felt like a small win. Things took another turn when Ethan was forced to move back home. With his business debts piling up and no steady income, he couldn't afford his rent anymore. My parents welcomed him back with open arms, but it didn't take long for tensions to build. Ethan started asking them for more money to get back on his feet, and my parents began bickering over how much they could realistically give him. I thought things couldn't get messier, but I was wrong. My parents started reaching out again, dropping hints about how their finances were worse than they'd let on. They wanted me to step in, not just to help Ethan, but to keep their household afloat. I held my ground, knowing that giving in would only enable the cycle to continue. Now, with Ethan back home and the financial strain worsening, the cracks in my family's foundation are turning into full-blown fractures. And just when I thought things couldn't unravel further, I stumbled upon a family secret that could change everything. Update 2. Things started unraveling in a way I couldn't have imagined. While Ethan settled back into my parents' house, comfortably avoiding any responsibility for his failures, I stumbled across something that changed everything. A distant cousin reached out to me out of the blue. We hadn't spoken in years, but he mentioned hearing about the family drama and wanted to check in. During the conversation, he casually brought up the family business. Specifically, he asked if I knew that Ethan's house had been purchased using the business as collateral. At first, I thought he was mistaken. Why would my parents risk the business for Ethan's house, especially when it was clear he couldn't handle his own finances? But the more we talked, the more it started to make sense. It explained why my parents were suddenly struggling so much financially. I did some digging, and it didn't take long to confirm the truth. The business loan Ethan had defaulted on was secured using the family business as collateral. Now, with the loan in default, the business itself was in jeopardy. My parents hadn't mentioned a word of this to me, not during their calls for help, not during their hints about needing money, not ever. I confronted them about it during a visit. My dad tried to play it off, saying it was a calculated risk to help Ethan get a fresh start. My mom blamed the bank, claiming they were being unfair and aggressive with their demands. Neither of them acknowledged the gravity of what they had done. They weren't just risking their retirement or their house anymore. They were risking the livelihood of the employees who depended on the business and the legacy that had been built over decades. When I pushed for answers, they deflected. They said they couldn't just turn their backs on Ethan and insisted they still had options to fix things. Their refusal to take responsibility made it clear that this was a pattern they weren't willing to break. The word of the crisis spread quickly through the family. My aunts and uncles decided enough was enough and organized a family meeting. They invited everyone, including me, my parents, and Ethan. The goal was to figure out a way to address the financial mess and confront the favoritism that had caused it. Ethan showed up late, reeking of alcohol, and made no effort to apologize for it. While everyone else tried to have a serious discussion, he cracked jokes and rolled his eyes, clearly unbothered by the weight of what was happening. When someone asked him if he felt any responsibility for the situation, he laughed and said, "It's not my fault the business couldn't handle one loan." That was the moment the extended family turned on him. One by one, my relatives started calling out my parents for enabling Ethan's behavior. They pointed out how I had worked hard for everything I had while Ethan had been handed opportunity after opportunity. My parents looked uncomfortable but still tried to defend Ethan, claiming he just needed more support to get back on his feet. The meeting escalated when Ethan accused me of turning the family against him. He stood up, pointed at me, and said I'd always been jealous of him. He claimed I was the reason his business failed because I refused to help. The room went silent. My uncle, who had been quietly observing up until that point, finally spoke up and told Ethan to sit down and take responsibility for his actions. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. After the meeting, I learned something that left me speechless. One of my uncles mentioned in passing that my parents had changed their will. They had decided to leave the entire family business to Ethan, cutting me out completely. The news wasn't entirely shocking, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. They had gambled the business to bail Ethan out, and now they wanted to hand it over to him entirely, despite his track record of destroying everything he touched. That was the last straw for me. I contacted a lawyer and formally removed myself from any legal ties to the family business. If my parents wanted to risk everything for Ethan, I wasn't going to be dragged down with them. It was a hard decision, but it was necessary. Without my involvement, the business began to decline rapidly. Ethan predictably had no idea how to manage it, and my parents were too preoccupied trying to clean up the financial mess they had created. Employees started quitting, and longtime clients began pulling their contracts. Meanwhile, my Reddit posts started gaining traction. Thousands of people shared their thoughts, advice, and similar stories. It felt strange to see my personal life laid out for so many strangers, but their support helped me realize I wasn't alone. Many encouraged me to keep focusing on my own happiness and leave the family drama behind. A week later, I received an emotional letter from my parents. They apologized for their actions, but the letter was laced with justifications and subtle guilt tripping. It didn't feel genuine, it felt manipulative. They wanted me to step in and help save the business, but I knew better than to get pulled back in. Ethan, meanwhile, has been oddly quiet, or so I thought. A family friend recently told me Ethan is working on another big idea, one that could have even bigger consequences for everyone involved. I have no idea what he's planning, but if history is any indication, it's not going to end well. Update 3. It didn't take long for Ethan to jump into his next scheme. This time, it was a luxury car rental business. He claimed he'd done extensive research and insisted there was a huge market for high-end vehicles rented out for events like weddings, music videos, and weekend getaways. Ethan pitched the idea to my parents as if he had already secured a fleet of cars and a long list of clients waiting to sign up. Despite everything that had happened with his previous failed business and their current financial struggles, my parents were all in. They used the last of their home equity to co-sign another loan for him. When I found out, I was furious. I told them point blank that this was a terrible decision, that Ethan had proven he wasn't capable of running a business. But they dismissed my concerns, accusing me of being unsupportive and holding a grudge. Predictably, the business crashed and burned almost immediately. Ethan spent most of the loan on leasing flashy cars and marketing the business with expensive, unnecessary extras. He rented an office in a luxury building downtown, claiming it was necessary to attract the right kind of clients. But he didn't budget for insurance, maintenance, or even a team to handle bookings and logistics. Within 3 months, the cars were being repossessed and Ethan had nothing to show for it but unpaid bills and a growing list of angry customers demanding refunds. The fallout hit hard. My parents couldn't cover the loan payments, which meant they couldn't keep up with their mortgage either. They were forced to sell their home and move in with Ethan, who had already been struggling to pay his own rent. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents, who had bent over backward to support Ethan, were now depending on him for a roof over their heads. It didn't last long. Ethan's landlord received complaints from neighbors about unauthorized car rentals being run out of the apartment building. Apparently, Ethan had been using his place as a makeshift storage lot for the remaining vehicles, and tenants weren't happy about the increased noise and traffic. The landlord evicted him, leaving Ethan and my parents scrambling to find a place to stay. Meanwhile, I had been keeping my distance, focusing on my own life. Work was going great, and I had started seeing someone who genuinely supported me and encouraged me to maintain my boundaries. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally prioritizing myself. That peace was interrupted when I got a call from Ethan. He asked if I could let our parents stay with me temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. I refused, explaining that I couldn't sacrifice my space and stability for their poor decisions. Ethan didn't take it well, launching into a rant about how I was abandoning the family. I hung up before he could finish. Not long after, my parents reached out directly. They apologized for their past actions, but it was clear they expected me to step in and help them financially. Their tone was different, less demanding and more desperate, but the message was the same. I offered emotional support, reminding them that I was there for them in non-financial ways, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be bailing them out. By this point, even the extended family had run out of patience with Ethan. My aunts and uncles, who had initially tried to mediate and offer advice, began cutting him off financially and socially. One of my uncles, who had loaned Ethan money for his first business, publicly declared he was done enabling him. Without the backing of our relatives, Ethan was left completely isolated. To make matters worse, Ethan started facing legal trouble. Some of the customers from his failed car rental business filed lawsuits, claiming he had misrepresented his services and left them stranded after canceling their bookings. One particularly angry client posted a lengthy review online, detailing how Ethan had promised a luxury vehicle for their wedding but never delivered, leaving them scrambling for a replacement on their big day. The bad press spread quickly, and Ethan's reputation was in shambles. As all of this unfolded, I received a cryptic message from my parents: "We've lost everything. Can we talk?" For a moment, I wondered if this was another attempt to guilt me into stepping in, but something about the tone felt different. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing: whatever came next, it wasn't going to be good. Update 4. The message from my parents caught me off guard, but after some thought, I agreed to meet them in a neutral, public place. I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me wondered if it was another guilt trip, but something told me this meeting might be different. When we met, my parents looked more tired and defeated than I'd ever seen them. Over coffee, they began apologizing. It wasn't just a casual "we're sorry" either. They laid everything out. They admitted they had treated me unfairly for years, favoring Ethan and making excuses for his behavior. They acknowledged how much damage it had done to me and to the family as a whole. They said they were ashamed of how blind they had been. For the first time, they didn't try to justify their actions. As sincere as their apology sounded, I couldn't help but be skeptical. After everything that had happened, it was hard to trust their words. I listened, but I stayed cautious, waiting to see if there was more to the story. And there was. They told me they had decided to sell the family business. The debts were too much, and with Ethan's mismanagement, the business was barely breaking even. They said they wanted to use the money from the sale to pay off their debts and move into a smaller, more affordable home. They asked if I would help oversee the sale process, knowing I had experience with the business and its clients. I hesitated. I didn't want to get dragged back into the chaos, but I also didn't want to see the business and the people who worked there suffer because of my parents' poor decisions. I agreed to help with the sale, but I made it clear I wouldn't be involved beyond that. This was their mess to fix, not mine. Ethan found out about the decision a few days later, and to say he didn't take it well would be an understatement. He stormed into my parents' house, demanding to know why they were throwing away his inheritance. He accused them of betraying him, insisting the business could still succeed if they gave him one more chance. For the first time, my parents stood firm. They told Ethan he needed to take responsibility for his own life, and that they couldn't keep sacrificing everything for him. That didn't go over well. Ethan exploded, accusing me of brainwashing our parents and turning them against him. He claimed I'd been plotting to take everything away from him out of spite. It was classic Ethan, blaming everyone but himself for his failures. The sale process was as messy as I expected. Ethan sabotaged it at every turn, spreading rumors to potential buyers and even showing up unannounced to meetings. He claimed he had a right to be involved since it was his business. It was exhausting, but eventually we found a buyer who saw through the drama. The final sale price wasn't great, definitely less than what the business was worth at its peak, but it was enough to cover my parents' most urgent debts. After the sale was finalized, I felt a surprising sense of relief. I had kept my boundaries intact, helping without getting sucked back into the chaos. My parents thanked me, and for the first time it felt genuine. They promised they were done enabling Ethan and were ready to start fresh. I hoped they meant it. True to their word, my parents used the money from the sale to pay off their debts and downsize to a modest home. They joined a local support group for families dealing with financial recovery, and my dad even picked up a part-time job to keep busy. They seemed determined to rebuild their lives without falling back into old patterns. Ethan, on the other hand, continued to spiral. With no financial backing and no one left to bail him out, he burned through what little goodwill he had left. He bounced between low-paying jobs, struggling to hold on to any of them for more than a few months. Eventually, he stopped showing up at family events entirely. The extended family, who had already cut him off financially, stopped reaching out altogether. In therapy, I talked about how freeing it felt to finally prioritize my own needs. For so long, I had been caught up in the dysfunction, trying to fix things that weren't my responsibility. Letting go of that had been one of the hardest but most rewarding decisions I'd ever made. Just when I thought the dust had finally settled, I got a notification. Ethan had sent me a message. It was short and cryptic: "You can't hide forever. The truth about this family will come out, and everyone will see you for who you really are." I stared at the message for a moment before closing it. Whatever Ethan was planning, I wasn't going to let it drag me back into the chaos. For now, I'm focused on moving forward. But with Ethan, there's always another twist waiting around the corner. Update 5. Not long after Ethan's cryptic message, I found out what his truth about the family was. He posted a long, rambling tirade on social media, accusing me of sabotaging his life and painting himself as the victim. According to Ethan, I had turned the family against him out of jealousy, manipulated my parents into selling the business, and stolen what should have been his future. At first, I braced myself for the fallout, but the post didn't land the way he thought it would. Instead of rallying support, it only highlighted how far Ethan had fallen. My extended family, who had witnessed years of his antics firsthand, were quick to shut him down. Several relatives commented directly, pointing out the opportunities Ethan had squandered and how much my parents had sacrificed for him. A few of his old friends chimed in too, calling him out for his inability to take responsibility. Ethan tried doubling down, but the more he posted, the worse he looked. Eventually, the post was deleted, along with most of his social media accounts. I heard through a mutual friend that Ethan had been quietly blocked by several people in his circle who were tired of his drama. Watching the situation unfold made me realize how much support I had, not just from my family but also from friends who had been in my corner all along. Meanwhile, my parents were doing surprisingly well in their downsized life. They joined a financial recovery support group, which seemed to help them process everything they'd been through. My dad took a part-time job at a local hardware store, while my mom started volunteering at a community center. For the first time in years, they seemed grounded in content. They even started attending therapy, which I hadn't expected at all. Ethan, on the other hand, continued his downward spiral. Without anyone left to bail him out, he started burning through his remaining relationships. A former coworker told me Ethan had been fired from his latest job for missing too many shifts and blaming others for his mistakes. He moved in with a friend temporarily but was kicked out after a fight over unpaid rent. While all this was happening, my life took a different path. My career had been thriving ever since I set those boundaries, and I landed a promotion that put me in charge of a major project at work. Around the same time, my partner proposed during a weekend getaway. It wasn't flashy or over the top, but it was perfect for us. For the first time, I felt surrounded by love and support that came without conditions or drama. We planned a small, intimate wedding and decided not to invite Ethan. It wasn't a hard decision. He had burned that bridge long ago. My parents came and, to my surprise, expressed how proud they were of me. During the reception, my dad pulled me aside and said they had been wrong about so many things, especially the way they treated me compared to Ethan. He promised they would never repeat those mistakes. It was a moment of reconciliation I hadn't expected, and while it didn't erase the past, it felt like a step toward healing. A few weeks after the wedding, I received an email from Ethan. It was short and vague, apologizing for some of his behavior, but also hinting that he was still angry about the way things had turned out. I didn't respond. Instead, I discussed it in therapy, where I reaffirmed my decision to protect my peace. I had worked too hard to set these boundaries, and I wasn't about to let Ethan pull me back into his chaos. The updates from Ethan's life became less frequent after that. I heard through the grapevine that he had moved out of state and was trying to start over. Part of me hopes he finds a way to turn things around, but I also know it's not my responsibility to fix him. Reflecting on everything, I can't believe how far I've come. There was a time when I felt trapped in the dysfunction of my family, constantly trying to prove my worth or earn their approval. Now, I'm in a place where I prioritize my own needs and surround myself with people who genuinely care about me. At a family dinner not long ago, my parents apologized again, this time unprompted. They admitted their favoritism had caused a lot of harm and promised to be better in the future. It's not something that can be fixed overnight, but seeing them take accountability was more than I ever thought I'd get. As for Ethan, I don't know what his future holds, but I've made peace with the fact that his choices are his alone. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to protect yourself. And in some cases, it's the only way to save your family too. Looking back, I'm grateful for the strength I found in myself and the support I discovered outside my immediate family. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that's more than enough. I'm a 28-year-old guy from what you'd probably call a wealthy family. Growing up, everything looked perfect from the outside. My parents were the kind that hosted fancy dinner parties, went on yearly vacations abroad, and made sure we had everything we needed. But anyone looking in from the outside wouldn't see what was actually happening inside our family. I have an older sister, Lily, who's 30 now. To everyone else, Lily is the perfect golden child. She's smart, charming, and knows exactly what to say to win people over. She's the kind of person who can get out of a speeding ticket just by smiling and making small talk with the officer. It's been like this our entire lives. My parents practically worshipped her growing up. If Lily wanted something, she got it. And if I wanted something, it was usually met with, well, let's see what Lily thinks. Despite that, we had a decent sibling relationship. We'd hang out, go to family events together, and she'd even call me her favorite brother, even though I'm her only brother. For years, I just accepted that she was the favorite. It was like an unspoken family rule. Lily gets the spotlight, and I'm the one standing just outside of it. I'm not saying my childhood was bad, just that it was clear I wasn't the priority. Things started changing a few years ago. Lily's always had a string of boyfriends, one after another. She's the type who falls hard and fast, and when it ends, it's a complete disaster. And every time it happened, I noticed a pattern. She'd come to me for comfort, which was fine at first because, she's my sister. But then she started making these weird comments. Stuff like, it's a good thing I have you as my backup plan. Or, if all else fails, I know I can always count on you. At first, I laughed it off. It sounded like a joke, and I figured it was just her way of coping with a breakup. It was awkward, sure, but not something I thought too deeply about. But then she started saying it more often, and it became less of a joke and more like she meant it. The last few times, she said it in front of our parents and even some of our mutual friends, and everyone just laughed along like it was some inside joke I wasn't in on. It didn't really hit me how serious it was until my girlfriend, Sophie 26F, pointed it out. We've been together for almost 2 years now, and she's great, supportive, kind, and not afraid to call out weird behavior when she sees it. Sophie has noticed these comments from Lily and pulled me aside one day, asking why I let her say those things. She told me it was disrespectful, not just to me but to our relationship as well. I tried to brush it off, telling Sophie that it's just how Lily is and that it doesn't mean anything. But Sophie wouldn't let it go. She said it made her uncomfortable, and that it felt like Lily was treating me like a backup option for her own failed relationships. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. It's like every time Lily said it, she was reminding me that I'd always be her safety net, whether I wanted to be or not. I started paying more attention to what was happening during family gatherings. The last few months, Lily's backup plan comments have become bolder. She said it during my dad's birthday dinner while everyone was sitting at the table. I was just sitting there with a glass of wine, listening to my parents talk about their plans for a holiday trip, when Lily casually said, "Oh, well, if I'm still single by 35, I'll just marry my brother." Everyone laughed like it was the funniest joke, but Sophie looked at me like she couldn't believe what she just heard. Later that night, Sophie asked me if I was okay with Lily saying stuff like that. And I realized, no, I wasn't okay with it. It was weird, inappropriate, and honestly a little creepy. But when I brought it up with my parents, they completely brushed me off. My mom said, "Oh, she's just teasing you. Don't take it so seriously." My dad laughed and said, "You're her brother. Of course she feels safe with you." It's not just my parents, though. Even some of our friends seem to think it's funny. Last week, we were at a small gathering with a few of our mutual friends, and one of them made a joke about Lily and me ending up together if she stays single. Lily didn't deny it. She just smiled and said, "Well, it's good to have a plan, right?" And everyone laughed like it was the most normal thing in the world. But it's not normal. It's not normal to treat your sibling like a romantic fallback option. It's not normal to joke about ending up with your brother if all your relationships fail. I realized I've been letting this go on for way too long because I didn't want to make waves or upset the family dynamic. But now it's affecting my relationship with Sophie, and I can't just ignore it anymore. Sophie has been pushing me to say something, to finally confront Lily and tell her it's not okay. I've been putting it off because I know it's going to be a huge blow up. My parents will probably take Lily's side as they always do, and I'll end up looking like the bad guy for making a big deal out of just a joke. But it's not just a joke anymore, and it hasn't been for a while. I'm done being the backup plan. I haven't decided when or how I'm going to confront her, but it's going to happen soon. I can't keep letting this slide. It's time I set some boundaries, even if it means upsetting the golden child and causing drama in the family. I just hope it doesn't end up being as bad as I think it will be. Update 1. I decided it was time to confront Lily, and I chose to do it during a family dinner. It was at our parents' house, a typical Sunday evening meal that we've been having for as long as I can remember. My girlfriend Sophie was with me, and I could tell she was nervous too. She knew this was going to be a big deal, but I felt like I had no choice. The comments had gone too far, and I couldn't let it slide anymore. Everything started off as usual. My mom had cooked a huge spread, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and all the fixings. My dad was talking about his golf game, and Lily was sipping on her wine, already acting like she owned the place. It was just casual small talk, but I was barely listening. I kept waiting for the right moment to bring it up, and then it happened. Right in the middle of a conversation about my cousin's upcoming wedding, Lily made her usual joke. She laughed and said, "Well, if I'm still single by 35, I guess I'll just have to marry my brother." She said it in this carefree, joking tone, and everyone at the table burst into laughter like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Even my parents were laughing, shaking their heads like it was some inside joke they were in on. I looked over at Sophie, and she wasn't laughing. She was giving me this look that said, "Are you really going to let this slide again?" So I took a deep breath and decided to speak up. I interrupted the laughter and asked, "What do you mean by that, Lily? Why do you keep calling me your backup plan?" The whole room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. My mom stopped mid-bite, and my dad put down his wine glass, clearly taken aback. No one was expecting me to actually say something. Lily tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a joke, and that I was taking it too seriously. But I didn't let it go this time. I told her that these comments were making me uncomfortable, and more importantly, they were affecting my relationship with Sophie. I said it wasn't funny to joke about using me as some kind of fallback option if her love life didn't work out. That's when Sophie jumped in. She looked right at my parents and said that the comments were disrespectful not just to me but to our relationship too. It was the first time Sophie had ever spoken up like that in front of my family, and I think it shocked everyone. My mom looked like she didn't know what to say, and my dad just stared at Sophie like she'd grown a second head. Instead of taking it seriously, my parents immediately jumped to Lily's defense. My mom said, "Oh, come on, she's just teasing. It's just a joke between siblings. You know how Lily is." My dad nodded in agreement, telling me that I was being too sensitive and that I needed to relax. They made it sound like it was my fault for causing a scene, completely ignoring how uncomfortable the whole thing was making me and Sophie. Lily, sensing that our parents were on her side, leaned back in her chair and smirked. She finally admitted, without any shame, that she sees me as her safety net. She said, "I just know that if things go wrong in my life, you'll be there for me. You're my brother, and that's what family does, right?" It wasn't a joke anymore. It was a statement, like she was entitled to my support, no matter what. I lost it. I told her that I wasn't her safety net, and it wasn't fair for her to treat me like some kind of backup plan she could fall back on whenever her life didn't go as planned. I said it was manipulative, and it wasn't okay for her to undermine my relationship with Sophie by making comments like that. The whole room felt like it was about to explode from the tension. My mom tried to calm me down, saying I was overreacting, and that I was the one ruining the family dinner. My dad looked furious, like I had embarrassed the family by speaking up, but I didn't care anymore. I stood up, grabbed Sophie's hand, and told them we were leaving. We walked out without another word, and I could hear my mom calling after us, but I didn't stop. As soon as we got home, my phone started blowing up with text messages from my mom. She was furious, saying that I needed to apologize to Lily for causing a scene and making everyone uncomfortable. She kept repeating that it was just a joke, and I shouldn't have taken it so seriously. I ignored her messages and put my phone on silent. I couldn't believe she was actually mad at me for standing up for myself. Sophie hugged me and told me she was proud of me for finally saying something. It felt good to have her support, but I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. I knew my parents would take Lily's side, and I was right. The next morning, I got a call from my dad, who told me that if I didn't apologize and make things right with Lily, they might have to rethink my place in the family. I talked to my friends about what happened, and they were all shocked. They couldn't believe Lily had actually admitted to seeing me as her backup plan, and they were even more surprised by how my parents had reacted. It was like they couldn't see how messed up the whole situation was. Since then, Lily has been giving me the cold shoulder, refusing to answer my texts or calls. She's playing the victim with our parents, and I can see now just how manipulative she can be. I've realized I've let this go on for far too long, and I've decided to take a step back from communicating with my family for a while. I need space to figure things out and set some boundaries. I'm going no contact with Lily for now. It's not what I wanted, but I don't see any other way to make them understand that I'm not her backup plan. I refuse to be. Update 2. After the blow up at the family dinner and going no contact with Lily, things got tense, but I didn't expect how quickly it would escalate. It started about a week later when I received a message from an unknown number. It was from one of Lily's ex-boyfriends. We'd met a couple of times at family gatherings, but we were never close, so it was strange for him to reach out. He said he wanted to give me a heads up. He explained that while they were dating, Lily used to mention me in a really weird way. Apparently, she'd casually tell him things like, "If this doesn't work out, I've got a backup plan." And he realized she was talking about me. He thought it was a joke at first, but she kept bringing it up, making him uncomfortable. He figured I should know, considering everything that happened between us recently. I was stunned. It was bad enough hearing Lily call me her backup plan at family events, but knowing she was talking about me like this with her boyfriends, it was disturbing. I showed Sophie the message, and she was horrified. She said it wasn't just manipulative, it was creepy and obsessive. It wasn't normal sibling behavior, and it confirmed everything I'd been feeling. We decided it was time to address this with my parents directly. I drove over to their house without calling ahead. When I got there, my mom was sitting on the porch, sipping her tea. I told her we needed to talk, and she invited me inside, looking concerned. My dad was in the living room, watching TV. I started explaining everything, the ex-boyfriend's message, the comments Lily had been making, and how uncomfortable it all was. They didn't take it seriously at all. My mom sighed and said Lily was just going through a rough patch. She told me it was my job as her brother to be there for her, especially now. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I pointed out that this wasn't just a rough patch, it was manipulative and unhealthy behavior. My dad chimed in, saying Lily had always been more vulnerable, and that they'd always expected me to look out for her if things went south in her life. Hearing that felt like a slap in the face. It suddenly made sense why they never took my side or why they always seemed to defend her. This expectation had been there all along, and I'd never even realized it. They saw me as a backup for Lily, just like she did. I left the house, fuming. Sophie and I talked it over, and I realized I needed to take steps to protect myself. Lily had a history of poor financial decisions, and if she was this comfortable treating me as her safety net, what would stop her from trying to involve me financially? I decided it was time to consult a lawyer. I made an appointment the next day. The lawyer listened to everything, including the messages from Lily's ex and the family dinner incident. He agreed it was concerning and suggested we take legal steps to protect my assets. He mentioned the possibility of filing a restraining order if Lily's behavior escalated, but for now he advised setting up legal barriers to make sure she couldn't try anything. I thought this would be a quiet move on my part, but somehow Lily found out. My guess is my parents told her, thinking it would make me back down. Instead, it triggered a complete meltdown. Lily called me nonstop, leaving frantic voicemails. She accused me of abandoning her and breaking family bonds. She said I was destroying the family by turning to lawyers instead of just doing the right thing as her brother. The messages were a mix of anger, pleading, and manipulation. It was like she couldn't decide if she wanted to guilt trip me or scream at me. I blocked her number after the 10th voicemail. I needed some peace, and it was clear she wasn't going to stop. Then came the ultimatum from my parents. They called me over, saying we needed to talk. I knew this wasn't going to go well, but I went anyway, hoping they might finally understand my side. Instead, they demanded I apologize to Lily and drop the issue entirely. My mom said that if I didn't, they might have to rethink my place in the family, including my share of the inheritance. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were using the inheritance as leverage to make me comply. It was like they were saying my worth to them depended entirely on whether or not I played along with Lily's games. I looked at them both and told them I didn't care about the money anymore. I'd rather be financially independent than be tied to a family that manipulates and uses me. That night, I decided to post about the situation on Reddit. I needed to get it off my chest, and I wanted to hear from people who weren't involved, who might give me an unbiased perspective. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments poured in, with strangers telling me they'd been in similar situations, that I was right to stand up for myself, and that I needed to protect my future. The support gave me the confidence I needed to make a tough decision. I called my parents the next morning and told them I was going no contact until they could respect my boundaries. I wasn't cutting them off forever, but I needed space. I blocked Lily on all platforms, no more texts, no more voicemails, nothing. It felt drastic, but I knew it was the right move. The silence after blocking them was deafening, but it was also the first time I'd felt a sense of relief in weeks. I don't know what the future holds with my family, but for now, I'm focusing on my own life and my relationship with Sophie. I'm done being Lily's backup plan, and I'm done letting my parents manipulate me. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm taking control of my own life. I just hope it stays that way. Update 3. It's been a few weeks since I went no contact with Lily and limited contact with my parents. I was starting to feel some relief, but I knew it was only a matter of time before something happened. I didn't expect the chaos that was about to unfold, though. One afternoon, there was a loud knock on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mom standing there. She hadn't called or texted, just showed up unannounced. Sophie was home with me and quickly stepped in front, asking what my mom wanted. My mom, without even acknowledging Sophie, demanded to talk to me. She insisted we needed to fix things with Lily because she was heartbroken and crying every day. Sophie wasn't having any of it. She blocked the door, refusing to let my mom in. They started arguing right there in the hallway. My mom raised her voice, telling Sophie that she was the reason our family was falling apart. Neighbors started poking their heads out to see what was going on, and I could hear them whispering. It was becoming a scene. Sophie stepped back inside, shutting the door behind her, and told me to handle it before it got worse. I stepped out into the hallway, trying to calm my mom down, but she wasn't listening. She kept going on about how I'd abandoned my family, how Lily was a mess without me, and how it was my responsibility to make things right. I couldn't take it anymore, so I told her about the message I got from Lily's ex-boyfriend, the one where he said she had been talking about me as her fallback option even while they were together. My mom's face went pale for a moment, like she'd been slapped. But instead of addressing it, she just muttered, she's scared of being alone. It was like she didn't even care about how twisted this whole thing was. She just kept insisting I needed to be there for Lily, no matter what. A couple of hours later, my dad called me. He was furious that I'd spoken to a lawyer. He didn't care about why I did it. He only cared that I'd taken things outside the family. He demanded that I apologize to Lily and drop the whole thing, saying it was my duty to keep the family together. It was clear my parents were fully on Lily's side, and nothing I said was going to change their minds. I calmly told him I was done being treated as Lily's safety net, and that unless they respected my boundaries, I was prepared to go completely no contact. My dad didn't take it well. He tried to pull the inheritance card, reminding me that my future financial support could be at risk if I didn't play nice. I told him I didn't care about the money anymore. I'd rather struggle on my own than be tied to a family that only valued me as a backup plan. That's when Sophie came up with an idea. She suggested we move in together permanently, far away from the drama. We'd already been spending most of our time at her place anyway, so it made sense. I agreed. It felt like the best way to put some distance between us and my family's mess. On moving day, everything was going smoothly at first. We were loading boxes into the truck when Lily showed up out of nowhere. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hair was a mess, and she was crying. She ran up to us, demanding to know why I was doing this to her. She pointed at Sophie, accusing her of stealing me away. She even tried to grab one of my boxes, saying I wasn't allowed to leave. A small crowd started to gather, neighbors watching the whole scene unfold. Lily was screaming, saying I was abandoning her, that I was breaking our family apart. Sophie, staying calm as always, took out her phone and started filming. She whispered to me that it was just in case we needed proof later. That only made Lily angrier. She lunged at Sophie, trying to grab the phone. It got so out of control that one of the neighbors called the police. When they arrived, I explained that Lily had been harassing me and we were just trying to move without any drama. The officer spoke to Lily, warning her to leave us alone. She stormed off, screaming that I'd regret this. After that, Sophie and I sat down and seriously discussed filing a restraining order. I didn't want to take it that far, but her behavior was becoming unhinged. It wasn't just an argument anymore, it felt like she was stalking us. I decided to talk to my lawyer about our options. A couple of days later, I started hearing from mutual friends. They told me that my parents and Lily were spreading rumors about me, saying I was an ungrateful son who had turned his back on the family after they supported me my whole life. They were painting me as the bad guy, and some of our extended family members had already started taking sides. But then, something unexpected happened. I got a call from an estranged aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. She told me she'd heard the rumors and wanted to give me a heads up. She said she wasn't surprised. They'd done the same thing to her years ago when she refused to comply with their expectations. She'd been cut off for standing up for herself, and she wanted me to know I wasn't alone. She offered me advice and told me to protect myself legally and financially. I took her advice and officially filed paperwork with my lawyer to protect my assets. We froze the joint accounts I had with my parents, making sure they couldn't access my funds without my consent. It felt like a necessary step, especially after everything that had happened. For now, I'm trying to move forward with Sophie and start this new chapter without the constant weight of my family's expectations. It's been a whirlwind, and I don't know what's going to happen next, but at least I'm finally taking control of my own life. Update 4. After securing legal protection and freezing my joint accounts with my parents, I thought things would calm down. I was wrong. My lawyer was still digging into the financial documents, making sure there were no loose ends. Then he called me into his office one morning, saying he'd found something I needed to see. He handed me a stack of papers showing a hidden bank account under Lily's name. It wasn't just any account, it was funded by significant contributions from my parents. We're talking large sums of money, transferred regularly over the years. My lawyer pointed out that while my parents had been pressuring me about inheritance and claiming there wasn't much left for anyone, they were secretly funneling money into this account for Lily. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. It felt like confirmation of everything I'd been feeling but couldn't prove. Lily was the golden child, and I was just there to pick up the pieces whenever she needed. My parents had been helping her financially all this time, even as they guilt-tripped me about family loyalty and inheritance. I felt betrayed, but it was time to confront them with the evidence. I asked my lawyer to set up a meeting with my parents at his office. I knew they wouldn't come willingly, but when I told them it was about a legal issue concerning the family trust, they agreed. When they walked in, they looked confused, like they were expecting a routine discussion. I laid the documents on the table and asked them directly about the hidden account. My mom's face went white, and my dad just stared at the papers, trying to compose himself. They stammered out excuses, saying it was just to help Lily get back on her feet after a few rough patches. They acted like it was a minor thing, like it wasn't a big deal. But my lawyer wasn't having it. He explained that the financial manipulation we uncovered gave me grounds to contest the entire family trust and inheritance arrangement. My parents looked stunned, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. Before they could say anything more, my phone started buzzing nonstop. It was Lily, blowing up my phone with a barrage of abusive texts. She'd obviously heard about the legal threats and was having another meltdown. Her messages were filled with accusations, claiming I was destroying the family and ruining everything. I blocked her number right there in the office. A few days later, my parents called for an emergency family meeting. I knew this wasn't going to be a calm discussion, so I insisted it take place in a public setting, a quiet cafe downtown, with my lawyer present. They weren't happy about it, but they agreed. When we arrived, the tension was palpable. My parents looked tense, and Lily was visibly on edge, her eyes red like she'd been crying. I didn't waste any time and brought up the hidden account, demanding an explanation. Lily broke down almost immediately. She started sobbing, saying she always felt like she wasn't good enough. She admitted she used me as a safety net because our parents made her feel entitled to my support. She pointed at them, saying they'd set us up against each other from the beginning, making her believe she deserved more because she was the vulnerable one. My parents looked horrified, but not for the reasons you'd expect. They were defensive, trying to deny everything, claiming they'd never manipulated us. But their story was full of holes. They kept contradicting themselves, and it was clear they were scrambling to cover their tracks. I just sat there, watching them dig themselves deeper. Then, something unexpected happened. My estranged aunt walked into the cafe. I hadn't seen her in years, but she looked calm, almost relieved to be there. She laid a folder on the table and began pulling out documents of her own. She revealed even more financial manipulation, showing a pattern of favoritism that had affected multiple relatives, not just me. She told us stories about how our parents had done the same thing to her years ago when she didn't fall in line with their expectations. They'd cut her off and spread lies about her, just like they were doing to me now. The cafe turned into a scene of chaos. Lily was sobbing uncontrollably, my parents were shouting, and the aunt was sitting there calmly, like she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. She looked at me and said, "I'm glad someone finally stood up to them." I realized there was no point in continuing the conversation. I stood up and told my parents I was done with the family drama. I wasn't going to listen to any more excuses or lies. I walked out of that cafe without looking back, feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The next day, I went to the bank and closed every joint account I still had with my parents. I set up new accounts with no family involvement, cutting off any financial ties they had to me. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. A few days later, I received a voicemail from Lily. Her voice was shaky and filled with tears. She apologized, saying she didn't realize how much she was hurting me and that she'd just been doing what she thought she was supposed to. It sounded sincere, but I couldn't trust it. I texted her back, simply saying, "I accept your apology, but I need space. I can't be your backup plan anymore." I blocked her number after that. I did the same with my parents. I needed a break from everything, from the manipulation, the lies, the expectations. It was time for me to focus on myself and start healing without their influence hanging over my head. For the first time in a long while, the silence feels good. I don't know what comes next, but I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready to move on, even if it means leaving my family behind for good. Update 5. After cutting ties with my parents and Lily, Sophie and I decided it was time for a real fresh start. We found a new apartment in a different city, far enough away that we wouldn't have to worry about any surprise visits from family. It was a nice place, with big windows and lots of light. Everything felt new and hopeful. We settled in quickly, unpacking boxes and making it our own. It was the first time in a long while that I felt like I could breathe. I started a new job around the same time. It wasn't a huge leap career-wise, but it was something I was genuinely interested in, and it kept me busy. The change of pace was exactly what I needed. Sophie and I also decided to start attending therapy together. It was eye-opening. We talked through everything: my family's manipulation, the years of feeling like I had to be Lily's safety net, and the impact it had on our relationship. The therapist helped me see just how toxic the dynamic had been and how long I'd been conditioned to put my family's needs above my own. A few weeks into this new chapter, I got a message from a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. He'd seen my Reddit post and reached out, saying he'd experienced similar treatment from our family. He told me stories that sounded all too familiar: how our parents had played favorites, how they'd pressured him to help Lily when she needed it, and how he'd been cut off when he started setting boundaries. He offered his support, saying he was glad someone was finally standing up to them. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in this. Around the same time, my estranged aunt got back in touch. She'd heard about everything that went down and invited Sophie and me to her home for a weekend getaway. I was hesitant at first, family trust issues and all that, but Sophie convinced me to go. The aunt's place was a cozy cottage by the lake, a perfect escape from all the drama. We spent the weekend relaxing, talking, and getting to know each other again. It was the healthiest family connection I'd felt in a long time. On our last night there, my aunt pulled me aside and handed me a thick envelope. Inside were documents she'd been holding onto for years. They were proof that my father had illegally altered the terms of the family trust fund, diverting a significant portion of it to Lily. It was exactly the kind of evidence my lawyer had been looking for, a legal bombshell that could change everything. I took the documents straight to my lawyer. He reviewed them and told me we had a strong case. We could sue for damages and challenge the entire trust fund arrangement. It wasn't just about the money, it was about accountability. My parents had manipulated everything for years, hiding the truth while pressuring me about family loyalty. This was my chance to finally expose their actions. As expected, when my parents found out about the legal action, they panicked. They sent me a long handwritten letter begging for forgiveness. They asked me to settle things privately, promising they'd make it right if I just dropped the case. It was a desperate attempt to avoid public scrutiny and legal consequences, but I wasn't interested in private apologies or hush money. This wasn't about reconciling with them, it was about holding them accountable for the manipulation and lies. I told my lawyer to move forward with the case. It was a long, drawn-out process, but with the evidence we had, the outcome was clear. We won. The court ruled in my favor, and I received a significant settlement. It wasn't just about the money, though. The real victory was knowing the truth had come out, that my parents' manipulations were exposed for what they were. It felt like the final piece of closure I needed. After the case ended, I decided to make the no contact permanent. I blocked my parents and Lily on everything, no more texts, calls, or letters. It was time to close that chapter of my life for good. The only family I stayed in touch with was my aunt. She became like a second mother to me, offering genuine love and support without any strings attached. It was a relationship I never thought I'd have, and I was grateful for it. Sophie and I started planning our future together. We got engaged in a small, intimate ceremony at the lake house, with just a few close friends and my aunt in attendance. It was simple and perfect, nothing like the over-the-top family gatherings I'd grown up with. For once, I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, without any hidden agendas or manipulative tactics. I shared one final update on Reddit after everything was settled. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments came in, congratulating me on the court victory and offering words of support. People shared their own stories of toxic family dynamics, thanking me for showing them it was possible to stand up for yourself and walk away. It felt like a full circle moment, seeing how many others related to what I'd gone through. In my final words, I left a message for anyone who might be feeling trapped in a similar situation. For anyone out there who feels like they're stuck in a toxic family dynamic, know that it's okay to walk away and build your own happiness. You're not a backup plan, and you deserve to be your own priority. The post went viral, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I'd shared my story, found my voice, and reclaimed my life. I wasn't looking back anymore.